Hey, welcome to the NAMA webinar on A Marketer's Guide to Podcasting. My name is Seth Herd with Brighton Agency.
And I'm Stephanie Lynch. We are really excited to talk to you today about podcasting. And we want to thank Jenny Pickett and Debbie Brummel from NAMA for inviting us and Brighton Agency to talk today about podcasting. So without further ado, let's get into it. So in today's webinar, we want to talk through four things. The first thing is why podcasts make marketing impact, what audiences want, when and how to launch a brand-owned podcast, and keys to a successful podcast. Why we're here today is because we know that more than 62 million Americans listen to podcasts weekly. That's a 17% jump from last year, and the largest spike since podcasts began somewhere around 2014. We believe that podcasts, according to the trending data, are here to stay, and that there are now more than 800,000 podcasts to choose from. So it is a content type that is continuing to grow. We want to walk through what we know about podcasting and help others begin and launch their own successful podcasts.
All right, so we're just going to run through the presentation here. We're going to spend about 5 minutes on the introduction, a 10-minute overview of what's going on with podcasts, just to catch you up on how this grew into such an explosive marketing channel. I'm going to spend 10 minutes on the audience. We're going to take a look at how to build out content streams and ads, just a brief aside on podcast production, and then summarize the whole thing.
So that leads us into introductions. I'm Stephanie Lynch. I'm the director of the Brighton strategy team at the Brighton Agency. I have about 20 years of experience in marketing. I've worked in various industries, including tourism, pet care, and CPG. I've worked with clients like Energizer, Build-A-Bear Workshop, Buffalo Wild Wings, Emerson, Monsanto, and Bayer, Mars Pet Care, and the Missouri Division of Tourism. I have a background in art, entertainment, and teaching and education. And I'm really excited to share the knowledge around podcasting, especially with my coworker, Seth. Seth?
All right, my name is Seth Herd. I'm a member of the Brighton strategy team. I've got 17 years of experience in marketing and communications, and I've got a decent amount of ag experience, both on growing up on a working farm and actually being involved in ag radio at one point. My background's in radio, public relations, and digital marketing.
So who is Brighton? Well, Brighton is a full-service marketing creative agency. We're based in St. Louis, Missouri. We are a woman-owned agency owned by Tina Vonderhaar. We've been around about 30 years. In fact, we just celebrated our 30th anniversary in 2019. We also are a member of the ICON network, which is a global agency network. Of course, we are proud members of NAMA, and we regularly have members and staff from the agency working within NAMA. And we're a top workplace in 2018. So that's a little bit about us.
All right, we're going to go ahead and jump into an overview of podcasting as a medium, as a genre, and as a marketing channel right now.
So here's what we know.
Sorry, I thought I double skipped.
That's okay. So here's what we know. Back in 2004, that really marked the beginning of podcasts. That's a long time ago. And in terms of when and how this was created, podcasts really came about because of the newly released iPod, which really allowed people to be able to listen to digital audio and to download that audio, as well as carry it around with them when they're jogging, waiting in line, during their commute. USA Today was the first major publication to cover this trend, and they called podcasting free amateur hobby chat fests, which is kind of funny when you think about it and think about where the growth of podcasting has gone since 2004. One of the things that's notable about the early history of podcasting is that iTunes definitely played a role here in making podcasting searchable. And in terms of some key people who were in the podcasting space very early on that made podcasting become more interesting to the general public, We have President Bush, who made his weekly radio address available in 2006. And then, of course, NPR's This American Life launched in 2006. It's a very popular show in the podcasting land. So, right from the beginning, the technology around this was important and critical. One of the things that Seth and I talked about when we were putting this information together was, early on, who was listening to podcasts. Who was listening to podcasts early on were techno nerds, people who listened to Wired magazine, or people who read Wired magazine. And so, in the very beginning, if you didn't have an iPod, or you didn't have the technology or the software, you weren't really interested in tech, podcasting was just for those techno nerds. Then, when we get into 15 years later, podcasting is really starting to hit its stride. So in 2019, podcast ads are hitting around the billion mark. That's up 23% from 2018. And the growth in podcasting advertisement just in general is growing exponentially faster. The graphic on the right is showing the rise and also showing podcasts within context of radio and global music. Now, podcasting is not in the same stratosphere as radio, but it is still creating a very strong growth pattern. I mentioned Wired magazine earlier. Here's a really fun quote from Miranda Katz, an editor at Wired. Podcast listeners really are the hyper-engaged, super supportive audiences that everyone hoped. So they are a little bit different from your general music file, your general music listener, or your radio listener. And because of that sort of technology beginning, your audience initially was very techno savvy. Now, as podcasts have become more mainstream, that demographic is changing just in terms of, general consumer. And we're going to talk about the audience a little later. So what else has happened since the history of podcasting? Well, one of the things to note is that Spotify has really become a major player here in terms of accelerating the medium. So Spotify is another piece of software technology that allows you to listen to music as well as podcasts. And what happened in 2015 was that Spotify started to acquire and merge different companies together so that they could own more of the listenership. They made very specific acquisitions in content, talent, and technology, including acquiring Gimlet Media, which was a startup that included a lot of different celebrities and influencers at the time. One thing to note is that, farmers are also listening to Spotify. They are listening to music, and that there is some access points there that, in terms of using Spotify to accelerate podcasting and understanding what podcasting is, that could absolutely help this broader general consumer as well as the ag audience. If we fast forward to 2020, you can see that podcast listenership is exploding. What you're looking at on the right-hand side, the graphic is showing the trend line from 2020 to 2024. So right now we've got about 31.7% of the US is listening to podcasts. That the trend in 2024 is that close to 40% of the American public will be listening to podcasts. So there's two major factors to that growth. The exponential growth in content. So being able to access quality content, podcast shows that resonate with the listener, that are specific to what the listener is looking for, and the rise of the smart speaker. So now that everyone has an Echo inside their house, or an Alexa, if that's what you call it, we call it Echo in my house, the being able to listen to content through the smart speaker is really helping people access the podcast themselves.
All right, we're going to go ahead and jump into the audience. Stephanie mentioned that in the beginning, this was very much a tech nerd kind of thing. You had to own a certain kind of device to even be able to access these back in the early to mid 2000s. So what's going on now that there's been an explosive growth in the audience? Well, the first thing that we're seeing here is this is a fairly even split male to female, and we are sitting right there in the 18 to 44 demographic for the prime age. So getting out of college on into kind of full on career mode. But I do want to go ahead and point out that we do have 10% of the audience as in the 55 to 64 demo, and 9% of the audience in the 65 plus demo. So the idea that this is, something that's emerging or something that we should wait on at this point, we're seeing. We're not early on in the bell curve here. This is something that has arrived, and it hasn't arrived quite as quickly on the content side of the ag space. But that's actually part of what's so exciting, is that the players that got in early are now growing exponentially, and there's a lot more room for content, which is what we're going to get into. So for sure, the people are there, and they're ready to hear more from us.
There's also something really special about people who listen to podcasts, the audience in general. People who are listening to podcasts tend to listen when they're driving or commuting, doing physical labor. And the reason why is that they can really zone in on the audio, that those are activities that you can be doing while you're maintaining a focus on something else. So engagement is super high. People are not listening to podcasts and watching TV at the same time. They're not multitasking across devices. They're really focusing and listening to the podcast. And 80% of listeners are finishing most or all of the podcast, meaning that not only are they highly engaged in the beginning of the podcast, but they tend to listen to the whole thing. Whether they do it at one time or not, they're going to pick it up and come back to it. So it's really critical to think about what the audience is doing and why you would want to connect with them as a brand during that time, knowing that this is a chance for you to provide education or information or entertainment with an audience that is going to be highly tuned into what you're saying. Again, this is very different from saying from a channel like social media, for example, where you're going to push out content that people may be looking at and they may be engaging with, but they're doing it while they're watching TV or while they're cooking dinner, while they're doing something else. Whereas podcasts, you're really focused and zeroed in on the listening.
All right, we're going to go ahead and jump into the content and then also ad strategy here. Taking a look at the content types, podcasting is a lot more personal content delivery medium than social media. A large percentage of podcast listeners say they would tune into the medium more if there were more content that interested them. To me, there's no space that this is more obvious than ag, because the shows that are doing well are doing really well, and there's just not that many of them. So this is an exciting place for us all to live, to consider what the future can look like. As far as the top categories, comedy is number one. People love to laugh. But after that, it's education and news. And this fits our space so well that we've got a lot to offer here that maybe is being tapped into for a lot of other kinds of campaigns, but hasn't been tapped into for downloadable audio yet. And all the signs point to the audience is there and hungry for it. And just a great pull quote we found here. When you want to connect with your customers on a more personal level, sound allows the listener to hear the emotion behind the words. All right. So why use podcasting over other forms of content? First of all, there's not a tech barrier. We still have a lot of farmers, obviously, that are on 3G, maybe that even have a data cap on their broadband capacity at home. They can't stream hours and hours of video at home if they have a data cap, but grabbing a piece of audio and taking it with them is something that's pretty easy. And if they're out in the field, they don't have real, solid service for streaming that is a downloadable. You can't do that with YouTube. You can't do that with, other pieces of content like TV. And then as we see podcasts listening shift to smart speakers as well, it's very easy to call up an episode, hey Echo, hey Alexa, hey Google, play the most recent episode of, and it's right there. And then downloadable smartphones, as I mentioned, is really, really good for a rural audience. And then free and on demand. Okay. So radio is great. It's there for everybody, but it's limited in what it can offer. It's limited in the amount of time that it can give any one segment. And then other forms of streaming are normally going to be subscription based. You're just not going to reach as many people if they have to pay for it. You may reach more loyal listeners in paid channels, but your general audience is going to get cut down, which is not something that we normally are looking to do when we're looking at audiences. And finally, long form content. When we look at the actual top shows, you're maybe going to be surprised if you're not an avid podcast listener yet at the length of shows that you can really go deep into topics, and that is what the audience wants. Don't be surprised when you see some of the top podcasts on the charts be episodes that are 3+ hours long in some cases. Listeners really want to go deep with you, and they're fine with not finishing it in one setting. They want the content, and if they kind of break it into 2 or 3 chunks while they're doing something else, that's great. Or if it's planting or harvesting time, 3 hours is absolutely nothing compared to what you're spending behind the wheel. So the content's right there for them to dive into in long form. All right, let's go ahead and look at some notable ag podcasts. Shark Farmer may be the one that is the most prominent on social media. Rob Sharkey is a grain farmer in Illinois. He first spun his show into being picked up by SiriusXM. So this is a native podcast that's being picked up and carried on satellite radio. And now that they're doing video, you can actually watch it on Sky News on satellite TV. Farmer to Farmer is another big one. That unfortunately is no longer going. But if you want to understand the medium, really recommend that you go back and check this one out. Chris Blanchard, the host, sadly passed away from cancer about 2 years ago. All the episodes are up. This is a really great piece of content to go back and research. And then I felt like this was a really unique one that's growing quickly, off-farm income. So this doesn't just have to be a medium that absolutely hits on, here are the best planting tips. Here are the best planter setting tips. You can go a lot of different ways with this audience. And if you're doing something that the audience cares about that nobody else has tapped into before, that's going to give you some very solid exponential growth. I'm going to look at 3 more real quick. The Young Farmers Podcast Network. This is a good intersection of ag and advocacy and awareness and building that from the ground up. The next one I'm going to mention, if you go take a listen to it, you're going to be like, wow, this doesn't actually sound that great audio quality wise. And I included it because of the fact that it's growing quickly despite its production barriers. And that's the Irish Farm Journal podcast. Now, this does sound kind of like it's a recorded phone call. And hey, everybody starts their podcasting journey at a different place. We're going to tell you not to do that a little bit later on in the webinar. However, this is a good piece of content to highlight because those farmers are so hungry and so looking for information about their space that they're willing to, in this case, deal with a little bit lower quality just because of the fact that there's nothing else out there and somebody dared to get in the space. And finally, the Profitable Farmer podcast. This is another international one. It's from New Zealand. It's an excellent example of looking at how to do something that feels organic and real and not salesy, but is in fact both a standalone piece of content and a top-notch, top of the funnel for some consulting that the host does. All right, how to think about podcast ads. We talked about how these are growing so quickly. They're not like buying any other kind of ads. Jason Houch, who's the Chief Creative Content Officer for How Stuff Works, describes pre-roll, mid-roll, and post-roll pre-recording ads as shouting at the listener. That doesn't mean that there's not some, still some value that you're going to get there. But what he really recommends is that instead you go for the organic reads. You go where the podcast host takes a break or just even weaves in, your product or service and really gives a personal testimonial. The next thing we want to recommend is own the listenership. Go for frequency over reach. So just because somebody's the biggest podcast on the block in a space doesn't mean that's the best place for you to grow sales for a client. Instead of looking at somebody that has 25,000 to 500,000 listeners per week, you may be better off splitting those dollars up among 5 podcasts that have 7 to 12,000 listeners per week, because you're going to be able to get more personal with those audiences for the same amount of money. Another thing to look at here is to expect to pay $18 to $25 per CPM. Prices are a little bit all over the place because this is still a new medium, and sometimes you'll see smaller shows that are charging a lot more for that per CPM. We would recommend that you don't dive into the 50, 60, $65 per CPM, purchases, because you can reach high quality audiences under those numbers. That's a healthy place to start thinking about it. And the next thing is to know the terminology. Pre-roll, mid-roll, outro, offer code, and direct response. So those first three should be pretty obvious about where they're at. Offer code has to do with the fact that a lot of podcast ads are actually driven by a personal landing page that's set up by the marketer. So, if I was selling you, we'll just go with a water bottle, it would be waterbottle.com/Seth podcast. If I was doing the live read, hey, this is the best water bottle in the market, go to waterbottle.com/Seth podcast and use the offer code Seth15 to get 15% off your water bottle when you make a purchase. That'd also be an example of direct response. We're not just going for awareness here. We are trying to drive sales in a trackable way. All right, I'm going to go ahead and dive into production here just a little bit.
All right, so there are three common types of podcasts that we want to talk about today in terms of genres of podcasts. That's the limited series podcast, ongoing talk radio style podcast, and podcasting for a live audience. When we think about limited series podcasts, this is probably the one that you may recognize the most. So when it comes to limited series, these are highly produced, documentary style. They have a lot of sound design to them. They typically cover an event, topic, or trend. So say something that happened in the past, like World War II history, for example, right? That it may be around a very specific battle, and then you're going to have a show around that battle, much like what you would see in a movie almost. And then it really requires a lot of high production quality and many hours to produce. That goes back to the sound design. There are a couple of different examples that we like to use when we think about these podcasts. NPR's Serial, which is a true crime story. That's probably the one that's most recognizable. Even if you never listened to Serial, you may have heard of Serial. It had so much awareness at the time when it was launched. NPR's S-Town. So this is another show from NPR. I highly recommend it. If you haven't listened to it, it's really, really unique. And then The Dropout, which was basically a documentary around a business scandal. These are examples of very specific documentary style, going around meaning interviewing people or interviewing the prime character in the drama, and then really fleshing out who those characters are with high quality sound. So making it almost like a sonic experience, similar to a video, you just don't have visuals. So again, this is way more sophisticated in terms of the level of production. You really need to be working with someone who understands probably not just soundscape, but also video. We see that those two expertises kind of go hand in hand when we think about really bringing a series podcast to life and making it entertaining enough for the audience to want to continue to listen. Now, there are some examples in the ag space of people doing these kinds of documentary style. Some of them were like spoofs of serial or different types of docudramas that are already out there. Those are kind of clever. But again, I think that if you want to consider doing or producing a podcast of this type, it's making sure that you have all of the planning and the production in line. And Seth's going to talk through that a little bit later in the webinar.
All right, let's go ahead and talk about talk radio style of podcast, which this is probably the space where you're more likely to be able to jump in. I do just want to pause for a moment and say, in your scope, do not confuse the first two categories here, because if you actually try to do a limited series podcast on an ongoing basis where you're cranking one of these things out every week, it will eat up all of your resources. So, because that takes so much planning, so much strategy, so much kind of pre-building on your narrative, and then so much interviewing, so much soundscape, that you really need to make sure that you're in a good space to be able to break something like that off and master it, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on. But the talk radio style of podcast is something that you probably have a better shot at. Stephanie, if you to jump in there.
Yeah, I was going to say that I couldn't agree with you more, Seth, in terms of really thinking about, budgeting for the limited series podcast. However, I don't want to dissuade anyone, and I know you don't either.
No.
Don't want to dissuade anyone, right, from venturing into limited series podcasts, because they're so intriguing and interesting, and they will stand out so much in the space if you go that route. Now at Brighton, we have produced a sketch for a limited series podcast that really did require a lot of sound design, going to into people's homes, so that you'd really hear, the sound environment. These were beautiful episodes. So again, I don't want to dissuade anyone from going in that route. Just know that you really need to be planning in advance. And absolutely what Seth is saying is that once you start kicking off your series, you want to make sure that you have your plans in place. So that if you are considering making one a week, that you can actually stick the landing and hit those deadlines.
Yeah. No, I guess I was just kind of speaking to what I've had a lot of Q&A about in the past, which is, it's audio. It can't be as hard as video, can it? It can. Absolutely. One of our production guys said, in some ways, it's almost more difficult because the sound has to be so perfect as to where the sound and video, you can maybe cut corners a little bit, and the visual is going to carry you through. In your limited series and in your talk radio style podcast, you really want to make sure that your sound is excellent. So jumping into the trends around talk radio style podcasts, which is, an easier way to get into this. News and education driven. Long form content is best. Now, what's interesting here is if you go through the 20 most downloaded podcasts in this style on both Apple and Spotify, which are the top two charts, there's nothing that hits the top 20 being under an hour long. That doesn't mean you have to go a full hour. It's just to give you a mentality of what's being really successful right now, and maybe to take the lid off of if we're not wrapped up by 30 minutes, the audience is going to get bored and leave. Particularly in the ag space, that's not true because of the way that the work goes. But also, podcast listeners are just used to that longer form content. The show's host is the show. So select this person carefully. If you think through who is your person that you want to put up on stage, who's your person that you want to put into a room to close a sale, you probably have a pretty good idea of who your host is. And that doesn't mean that they don't need to be caught up to speed on maybe some interview tactics, on a way to keep a show going, because doing a planned talk or doing or closing out a sale isn't exactly the same thing, but they're going to see their raw skills on display there. This is huge.
To your point, Seth, it could be helpful if you have identified someone internally that isn't necessarily a salesperson in the way that you're describing, Seth. You could get them some media training and get them trained up to speed to be able to speak openly in front of media, make sure they have talking points, walk them through that. Because back to Seth, that identifying this person is really important because they are going to become the face of the brand.
Yeah, and to bring up the salesperson specifically, one thing that you want to think through is this person going to be on the road or going to be gone a lot, that's probably not your person in that case. This last point we really want to drive home here. Do your research and make sure you're bringing new information to every show. You also can't just ride the host is the show, but you can't just ride on the host's personality if you're doing an hour plus. Nobody's quite that charming to be able to monologue or dialogue for that long and to be able to carry it. Your audience is going to keep coming back because you are adding value to their lives, their careers, and you are, essentially keeping the company, being their friend. But if you're not doing something new, kind of the one-trick pony thing is going to kick in pretty quickly. We also do want to say that, we're in a space with this where any broadcast audio recording at this point is a podcast. So if it's not radio over the radio waves, you are creating a podcast. We actually had a client that we created something like this for that in the past was maybe even a little bit nervous to call it a podcast because of the fact that, going back to that old stigma of this is only for tech nerds. If we call it this, are farmers even going to be interested? The audience is caught up there. If you're recording audio and putting out, you're doing a podcast. So you might as well go ahead and embrace that. and then set a schedule and stick to it. If you are not putting something out on the regular, quite frankly, there are other shows that are. And we talked about, as I just mentioned, this idea that essentially you're kind of being this person's friend as they're going about their day-to-day lives. Well, if they don't hear from you, that friendship is going to fade, and they're going to put their trust in other brands. Top examples of this: the Joe Rogan Experience is the #1 podcast online. This is one that I would say is notable for going 3+ hours. And the buckets of this show could be categorized as comedy, science, and current events. My Favorite Murder is an interesting show in that it's a fairly comedic take on the true crime genre. And this is pretty heavily driven by the personalities of the hosts. By the way, just to put this in context, these first two podcasts are making in excess of $50,000 to $75,000 per episode of ad revenue, and they're going long. The third one is The Rewatchables, which is new takes on favorite movies. Another one that's very high up on the ad revenue. And just to give you an idea of how much content people will consume, a lot of times the podcast episode about a movie that's a favorite movie goes longer than the movie itself. So consumers will sit through a conversation longer than the movie they watched, which gives you an idea of just how powerful this medium is and how long people will stick around for it. And then finally, podcasting for a live audience. You do have to think through this a little more, and this is something that's closer to the talk radio style of podcast as opposed to the limited series, because you're not going to be able to produce those soundscapes. This is really powerful because you're going to be able to simplify your message by producing across live social media channels through software. So we're talking about putting out the video on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube all at the same time, which is also a great way to market the podcast because people are seeing it and then are going to be able to subscribe to your channels. After the live broadcast, you want to take that audio, edit it down just a bit because the audience doesn't really want to sit through your check. Are we live? Are we here? Can you hear me? That's fine, actually. If they're tuning into a video, they know something's going to start. When it's just purely audio, they just aren't willing to sit through that. So just make sure you go ahead and clean that up. So the top examples of this, once again, we're back to the Joe Rogan Experience, who's built an audience on YouTube that isn't quite as large as the audio-only version, but people that are willing to tune into that daily, just like a podcast or just like a TV show. The Ringer Network, which is sports and pop culture, and then a music interview show called We Are Here, really are driven and marketed off of the live experience. People expect to tune in, even though they can catch it later on the replay on audio or video. They expect that they're going to be able to tune in and actually, leave comments on social media and interact with the show, discuss it with other fans as it's going on. It takes a little more planning, but this is a really cool way to engage with your audience and to market at the same time that you're doing product creation. And there's just so many different ways that you could go with this, with conferences, with live Q&A that your audience expects. Powerful tool. You just have to think through it and get your software in the right place. If you want to know more about that, you can certainly reach out to Brighton Agency, kind of more on a one-to-one discussion about that. All right. And then before we get this whole thing going, you want to consider your following before you begin production. Your expertise in storytelling is an absolute must. So when you're asking, is this the right thing for us? The first thing to ask is, who's your storyteller? Who can put together that narrative? And does, quite frankly, in your business, does this person have time? Can we make this a priority? The second thing is, despite the lone example of one podcast in Ireland, listeners will not tolerate poor audio quality. So you can't kind of learn as you go here. You need to have excellent, top-notch audio out of the gate on episode 1, or people are going to listen to 9 seconds, realize it's annoying to listen through the audio flubs, the poor audio quality, the mic hiss, and they're going to be on to something else. Expect to invest in equipment and or training. A lot of different ways you can get this done, but what you can't do is say, I'm going to buy $299 mics off of Amazon and we're going to watch YouTube for 15 minutes and figure this out. Back in 2004, that's where the whole medium was at, so you could get away with it. In 2020, the audience is expecting you to really do the hard work so that they have a great experience. And finally, recognize that editing is dependent on the nature of the show. Stephanie could probably speak to a little bit more on the soundscape side of things, just how in depth the editing went. And again,
Absolutely.
highly edited shows are more likely to be a big hit because people love them. But as far as your deliverables, don't shortchange yourself and cause an emergency at the business because you thought you could get this thing done in a fifth of the time because you didn't really sit down, plan out, and consider what that looks like. So for the soundscape project that we did, can you give us an estimate there?
Oh gosh. Well, it definitely took over 10 hours of editing time per episode, especially for the pilot episode. I think that's something to consider too when you are developing your podcast. Make sure you set aside budget for your pilot. Your pilot episode is what you want to prove to leadership that this is a viable entity, that the content is good. It's also a way to make sure that you have something in the can while you're developing other pieces. So if you need to trot out your podcast at any given time, you've got something ready. It's also really good to show listen to the pilot in terms of thinking about the various stakeholders that you might need beyond leadership. So for example, if you wanted to do a podcast, but you knew that you needed to connect to the communications department or an agronomy department, that there were different areas within your brand or business or even different agencies that would need to work together, the pilot is a way of creating a hub point for everyone so that they can learn more about what you're trying to achieve beyond just the treatment for the podcast. That way, when you go to those stakeholders, you could say, hey, this is what the podcast is. Can you help me identify facts, information, content, interviewees? Again, the pilot really helps you with that.
Yeah.
And going back to what Seth is saying, you need to really consider your budget all the way across in terms of the type of podcast that you're going to produce, making sure that you have budget for the pilot, and then making sure that you are not shortchanging yourself on the editing time that these things take, especially if you want to make changes to the podcast. It's just like with any other piece of creative. When you get the final podcast from your production company, you want to make sure that you've given yourself the bandwidth to make changes, either to the sonic style, or if you want to swap out an interview clip, you need to make sure that you're allowing budget for that.
Yeah, absolutely. One other point that I'm just going to throw in here is that if you really want to produce something that's top notch, you need to have some listening sessions before it goes live or as you're producing your content week to week, and do what I did. I cut my teeth in Chicago radio and was in that market for the first 10 years of my career. Anybody that was on the air dreaded the moment when you had to go in for your weekly or biweekly session where you actually went through your show with a fine-tooth comb and you got feedback. It's sort of like annual reviews. Nobody is super excited normally for annual reviews, but they are incredibly important, incredibly valuable. And if you want to grow and you want to see your numbers go up, you need to get together as a team and really ask those questions about, are we hitting the right market segment? Are our stakeholders happy? And what do those two groups think about this 10 minutes of audio? Next time, what would we change about that? Or if it's a soundscape podcast, what are we going to go back and rearrange before we put this out to make sure that we do everything in our power to get this thing to be a hit in the ag space?
And when as you were talking, Seth, it occurred to me that you really want to think about your podcast as similar to video production. The difference is that podcast listeners are a very unique audience for the things that we discussed earlier. They're very focused on the audio. Oftentimes, podcasting is really an expression for education and entertainment. People are oftentimes going to podcasts either to be entertained or to receive fact-based information. And I think that makes it really special, whereas video as a genre is perceived as anything and all of the above. It's a TV spot, it's a commercial, it's entertainment, it's a diary. It's the video as a genre is so ubiquitous that it does it serves a very broad purpose, whereas podcasting is way more unique. It's definitely a content tool to connect with an audience that's going to just totally zero in on what you're telling them, and then create a very tight engagement bond between you, the brand, and that audience for the future.
Yeah. And if you don't have some of those rules going in, and you don't kind of understand the context that you're stepping into, the audience is going to know it pretty quickly. If I can give an example from a TV show that was, fairly popular about 10 years ago, on the show 30 Rock, there was a character who in his 40s tried to go back to high school for like research for a TV show, and walked in wearing a shirt that said music band, and then walked up to a group and said, "How do you do, fellow kids?" Which it was meant to be awkward. That's the kind of experience you give the audience if they've been in the podcasting space as listeners for a long time, but you didn't take the time to go through several shows and really to plan out, what it is you're going to be about and have a business plan for this particular medium. You just look like you don't fit in the space, and the audience can sniff that out pretty quickly, and they'll just go ahead and move on to another piece of content. So your first step, if you are this is, maybe your very first introduction, could just be to take the next 14 days and really just sit with some shows and ask yourself the big questions of why is this working? Why is this connecting? And then how do I translate this for the space that I need to be into, as opposed to, you know what? We have a video booth. Let's go in there and talk and try to sell this thing and see what happens. Take some time just really to plan and to understand.
I think that's really important too. We really haven't spent a lot of time in this webinar talking about brand podcasts. So brands that are actually publishing and producing podcasts. Rather than spend a lot of time on that, I think it's really occurred to me that we are advocating that you look at podcasters who are really owning the podcast space. This reminds me a lot about YouTube. When YouTube first began, brands were pushing out content on YouTube and they were creating great content. But YouTubers were stealing that audience share away from brands time and time again. I mean, I could compare, like, for example, Trident pushed out a commercial on YouTube. I used this as an example years ago. A YouTuber created a spoof, like a humorous version of the commercial, and received millions more views than the actual spot made by the brand. It is really important to listen to what podcasts, like exceptionally good podcasters, are doing. And the examples that you went through, Seth, I think are really, really critical to that, rather than just going out and hunting to see if your competitor has a podcast. Really take the time to see what podcasters are doing, because that's what listeners really want, not necessarily a commercial from a brand, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You just the fact that it's all there is such a huge advantage. You can't go check out, a competitor's or, a client's competitor's Google Analytics or, their social ad buy and get a full picture of what's going on. But a podcast, it is the audio. It's right there in front of you. It is yours for the exploration and to be able to take those key lessons away. This is the perfect time to go ahead and dive into that. So to really sum up where we've been here.
Well, there's three things that we really want you to take away from this. And the first one is rapid growth in podcasting is trending, with opportunities to advertise or create your own podcast. So podcasting is here and it's here to stay. And we believe firmly, Seth and I, that brands can get in the game and create amazing, entertaining and educational content for their audiences and maintain that relationship for a long time. The second is the ag podcast genre has white space for new content, themes, and voices. Something that Seth and I were talking about before the webinar began is that every B-list, C or D-list celebrity has a podcast now, and that there's more and more content. Like I said earlier in the webinar, 800,000 unique podcasts and growing. People are looking for content that resonates with them. And there are definitely some notable ag podcasts out there, but there's plenty of white space for additional voices to connect to audiences. And similar to video production, podcast production requires planning and expertise. Yes, you can create your own podcast. Yes, you can receive results from that, which is true engagement with audiences, loyalty, being able to push out things like product launches and new information, updates about your brand on a regular basis, getting some really good metrics. Podcasts allow, just like a lot of other digital channels, allow for really great metrics and analytics. But you do need to plan ahead, and you need to consider podcasting as a genre similar to video that really requires expertise in that medium.
And that's what we have for you today. This is the moment where we really hope that you consider what it's like to get into this whole thing, because the numbers are there, the technology is there, and like we said, the white space is wide open. So we hope that you found this valuable. We really appreciate the time, and we hope that this has kind of spurred on some ideas for you about how you can take the top-notch people, top-notch ideas you have and translate that into audio.
If you have any questions, you can reach out to me or Seth. I'm Stephanie Lynch. Seth is Seth Herd. You can reach us at our first last name at Brighton Agency. I'm Stephanie.Lynch at BrightonAgency.com. Seth is Seth.Herd at BrightonAgency.com. You can certainly find us on LinkedIn with a very quick search. So we hope that you enjoyed the webinar, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions.